part 1 of this series, we made the cobblestone road, in part 2, the silicone mold, and in part 3 here, I'm going to show you how to cast it in resin using this resin SmoothCast 300. It's a 2-part A and B mixed by volume from a company called SmoothOn. The first thing I'm going to do is level the mold. The cobblestone road was level when we poured the silicone, so leveling the mold before we pour the resin should ensure an even thickness for the resin piece. A lot of people use some type of mold release when casting resin. It helps the resin pop out of your mold easier and can prolong the life of your mold by minimizing the direct heat contact that resin creates when it cures, which can dry out the surface of your mold. It's one of the reasons molds degrade over time, especially around thin details and seams. Over time, this dries out and gets crusty and brittle and eventually results in imperfect casts. This universal mold release by SmoothOn is a crowd favorite, and I used to use this religiously before I switched over to baby powder. I sprinkle the baby powder in and brush it into all the nooks and crannies with an extra soft bristle brush. With the spray release, I always felt like I had to wash the piece after casting to remove the oily film from the release, and then even primer it after that for better paint adhesion. But with baby powder, I can go straight to painting with no washing or primering. After it's sufficiently powdered, I lightly blow it off with my air compressor. Sometimes I'll have to stab a brush around to get it out of tricky little pockets, but for this piece I don't really care. Whatever powder is left in there will just add to the dilapidated cobblestone texture. The powder also acts as a surfactant. Liquids have surface tension. This is what allows a drop of water to hold that round shape. When you add a surfactant to the liquid weakens the surface tension of the liquid so the liquid can spread better. So in theory, lowering the chances that little air bubbles will form on the silicone and in the resin. There's no one way to use mold release, so experiment with what works best for you. I know some people that use both spray and baby powder together, but definitely use a respirator. There's a lot of sketchy things about talc and ingesting it into the body. I'm pouring rice into the mold here to get an estimate of how much volume I'll need. You can use water instead of rice here, but I don't really recommend it. Water and resin don't mix. So you'd have to make sure every little drop of water was out before you poured the resin. I only want a 1/2 inch thick piece here because I'll be mounting it on a 3/4 inch piece of wood. Next I'll separate the rice equally into 2 jars, which basically represents the part A and part B of the resin I need to mix. Try to get your amounts as equal as possible, but if it's not exact, don't worry, this resin is very forgiving. Give your resin a good shake, especially if it's been sitting for a long time. But shake it the night before you pour. You need to give all the bubbles a chance to disappear, otherwise they could end up in your piece. Here's the difference between freshly shaken resin and resin that's sat overnight. If you let it sit, all the little bubbles will float up to the top and eventually pop. These bubbles right here are just from carefully pouring part B into the glass jar. I want to do everything I can to mix this fast and get it into the mold, so I pour part B into the mixing container, let it debubble a little bit, and then I'm ready to mix. I linked these stir sticks in the description below. They're perfect for mixing resin. SmoothCast 300 has a 3-minute pot life, which means you have 3 minutes to get it poured before it starts to set up. But I'm really only spending about 30 seconds mixing here because the faster you get it in, the more fluid it will be. It starts off with a low viscosity like water. As soon as the heat sets off the reaction, it starts to thicken, and the chance increases that it won't flow into all the tiny details. Remember not to whip air bubbles in when you're mixing here. If you're worried about bubbles stuck in the resin, you can rap on the table a bit with your fists to vibrate the bubbles out, or even stab a little wire or tool in there to manually pick or move the bubbles out and up. You can also buy vibrating tables, but they're pretty expensive. I don't see any bubble problems here, but this is probably the simplest pour you can do, just a giant open-faced block. But I do like to think that getting in there quick and using the baby powder has something to do with the clean pour. I fast-forwarded to the 3-minute mark, which is when it hardens to a solid plastic. SmoothCast 300 has a cure time of approximately 10 minutes, but I'll let it hang out for at least 30 minutes, even longer if it has thin, delicate parts. The resin curing process is mass-dependent. So the larger amount of resin means the more heat produced, which means the mixed resin heats up faster and cures, or sets up faster. If you have thin masses like on arms and legs, the heat is spread over a thinner area, so less heat equals a slower cure time. So after 30 minutes it's still pretty warm, but I can pop it out of the mold pretty easily. And my rice calculations seem to work because it's about a 1/2 inch thick. And my obsessive leveling of the mold and resin pour also worked because it's got a pretty even thickness all around. You can see that it picked up these little tufts of the dragon grass we put on in part 1, but that was to be expected. I always consider the first pour a junk pour because it will pick up any little bits of debris from the original piece that might have gotten stuck in the silicone. So in theory, the second pour should be clean. And it should pick up every little grass texture. There's also a version of SmoothCast called 305. It's almost identical to the 300, but it has a longer set time and a longer cure time. It's a great option if you need a little more time to mix it and get it into the mold. I know a lot of artists that prefer the 305 because of this, but if you're in serious production mode, the shorter cure time can make a big difference. Next, I'll sand the edges and bottom a bit just to clean them up. My VIP tool pick for this video are these sand net pads. For resin and epoxy and polymer clay, these things are I also sand some random spots on the top here. I think this helps to get rid of the foam look a bit by adding some more random texture, and maybe some of the stones have a high polish from the horseshoes of the palace guard that patrol this road. Last thing is to hit it with some white primer. Krylon's always my favorite because of these little mist sprayer heads. I'm gluing it down to this nice 3/4 inch piece of walnut laminated plywood because I want it to look pretty on the bottom. I use these cobblestone roads mostly as bases for public art proposals, so I like to leave them white. And I like the wood grain look for this because they have an industrial product design look, which I think complements the R&D phase that the maquettes are part of. But you can always paint the edges white if you want a more uniform look. This is just with a spray primer. It works, but it looks a little Home Depot-y to me. I'd recommend painting it with an acrylic paint. I'm doing 2 coats of this heavy body acrylic from Liquitex. The heavy body is a little thicker so it can fill in any cracks or holes, similar to what caulking would do. And it will leave a nice painterly texture. Then I'll hit it with one last primer spray to get the whites to match. But let's say your cobblestone road needs to look super real to immortalize that epic battle between Kid Flare and Pooh Boy. Fortunately for you, I've added an encore to this series where I explain some basic painting techniques using simple washes and dry brushing, which you can fast forward to if you don't want to watch my 30-second fight breakdown. So the safe money would definitely be on Kid Flare here because he definitely has a reach advantage, especially with his riding crop. He even has a backup crop in case Pooh Boy manages to wrestle the first one out of his hands. But I don't think Pooh Boy's stubby little sausage arms can really do much of anything, which even adds to his reach disadvantage. I'd say 12-to-1 odds Kid Flare takes this. But you never know. Pooh Boy may have a secret weapon up his sleeve or on his head. But just to make sure it's a fair fight, we brought in Matilda to referee. She doesn't really have the highest fight IQ, but her situational awareness is higher than average. All 3 of these figures are made by Double Polar, probably the greatest toy designers to ever live. And now here's the link you've been waiting for that will show you how I painted this cobblestone road. Thank you for watching.